So this time we'll be knitting mini purse keychains, which are awfully cute. But what's really cool about this pattern is that by just adding a few rows, you can create all kinds of portable cases. Alright guys, for more information and a complete list of supplies, don't forget to visit the website, and let's begin. So we're going to drawstring cast on 17 pegs. Of course, either direction that you go is going to be fine. I always go to the right. Start with securing the working yarn to your anchor peg, and then you're going to take that working yarn and bring it to the back, and then come forward around that peg, and let's zigzag in and out with the working yarn, in and out, so that it's every other peg until you've covered all 17 of them. So here we go. Here's peg number 17, and now we're going to knit flat. So we're turning around and we're going to lay the working yarn flat in front of the pegs, and with the hook you're going to knit off every peg that has 2 loops, and as you can tell, that's every other peg. Make sure to keep your working yarn nice and loose. You don't have to do this tight, and you don't want to, because your next row will be more difficult to knit. So go ahead and continue, and again, as you can see, it's every other peg that has 2 loops on it, right? The ones with 1 loop you're going to ignore. Now back at peg number 1, you're going to notice that you only have 1 peg, and again, since we're knitting flat, you're going to turn around. So take your working yarn behind peg 1, half wrap it, and then take that working yarn and you're going to lay it over peg 2, half wrap, and knit off. And now we're going to knit the rest of the pegs using the U-wrap version of the knit stitch, and we need the whole row. So you're gonna just keep knitting again using the U-wrap version of the knit stitch. So you half wrap and knit off, half wrap, knit off, and keep going all the way until you get to peg 17, and at that point you're done with your cast on. Row 1 is super easy. All you're gonna do is knit the row. This time we're using the flat version of the knit stitch, and all that means is that you're laying your yarn flat in front of your peg and you knit off. For row 2, the pattern is now a knit 1, purl 1, and so we're going to begin on peg number 1 with the U-wrap version of the knit stitch. So you half wrap your peg and you knit off, and then you're going to take that working yarn and you're going to bring it in front of peg 2 under the existing loop, and with your hook from the top you're going to scoop up your working yarn to create a new loop. You're then going to pull and take off the existing loop, put the new one on, and pull your string to tighten that loop. Now we're going to start the pattern again. So you're going to knit 1, and the peg next to it you're going to do a purl stitch. Now if you notice, I have a stitch marker and I'm following the pattern. So where I have a stitch marker, I'm going to knit, and where I don't, which is the very next one, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to purl that peg, and I'm going to continue that knit 1, purl 1 until the end of the row. What I do want you to make note of is that when you get to the end of your row, which is peg number 17, you're only going to knit. So knit that peg, and now we're ready for row number 3, where we're going to flip the pattern, and now we will purl 1, knit 1, and we're going to start with peg number 17, and this time where I have a stitch marker I will purl. I'm doing exactly the opposite of what I did. Next I'm going to knit. My next one I'm going to purl, and again next one I'm going to knit. Now if you notice, I'm using the flat version of the knit stitch. That was almost by mistake, so don't worry about it. You can use a U-wrap or a flat knit, it's okay. and then you're going to repeat rows 2 and 3 more times. When you're done repeating rows 2 through 3 more times, you will have a total of 9 rows, including row 1. And I wanted to remind you not to forget to remove the knot off the anchor peg after a few rows. Okay, now rows 10 through 12 are just 3 rows of the knit stitch. When you're done, you're ready for the basic bind off, and this is worked over 2 pegs. So we're going to start by knitting off peg 17 and peg 16. And once you knit them off, you're going to move the loop from 16 over to 17, tighten the loop, knit off, and then you're going to take the loop off of 17 and move it over to 16. Again, we're working over 2 pegs, and from this point on, we're only going to knit off one of the pegs. So we're going to call this peg 1. We're going to knit off, take the loop from peg 1 over to peg 2. You're going to tighten that loop, knit off, and then you're going to move the loop from peg 2 over to peg 1. Now you have a new peg 1 and peg 2. And again, you're going to knit off peg 1 right here, and you're going to move the loop from 1 over to peg 2, tighten your loop, knit off, and move the loop from peg 2 over to peg 1. And now you have a new peg 1 and peg 2, and you're going to repeat the process until you're back at the front and you have bind off all the other pegs. Once the fabric is off the loom, it's time to stretch your stitches. The flat side of the fabric is actually your cast off, which is right here. You need to go to the cast on loops, and they're very loose, so you pull the drawstring and they will tighten up, and keep pulling. You'll see they'll turn into like a circle. Then get your needle. I'm going to use my metal needle. You can use the one that comes with your set, and go ahead and with the working yarn thread that needle, and we're going to sew the loops that were on your cast on. They are those 17 from the 17 pegs that you did your cast on. You're going to feed your needle through those loops, and you're going to create like a circle. So just make sure that you get all of them. Feed the needle with the working yarn through all of those loops, and then pull the needle, and as you do that, you'll see that it starts to create a circle. So just keep pulling until you close that little hole nice and tight, and then take the needle and you're going to go through those same exact loops again. So this is the second time. At a minimum, if you want to do another one, that's fine. I'm just going to do 2, and then we need to bring those 2 sides together because we're going to close those up. And you're going to start by feeding your needle through the very bottom ones that are closest to the circle, and you're going to go then upward and over to the side. feeding the needle through all of those stitches, again upward and then over to the next side. And some of them will look like little bumps. Those are the purl stitches. Don't worry about them. Just be sure to go side to side and that you get all of your stitches. So over to the side and then upward. Continue until you're all the way at the top of the project. And make sure that you have put the needle through all of those side stitches and that you close this up real nicely. And then you need to, if by any chance yours ends up like mine, where you have this like little hole at the top, don't worry about it. Just take your needle and feed it through a few stitches until you hide that little hole, and then you need to feed the working yarn through in order to weave in your end. So just feed it through. I go down the project, and then you can go ahead and get the other leftover yarn, working yarn, and weave it in. And I will normally weave the working yarn down and then I turn it around and I go back upward, but it's not necessary and I didn't do it here. Then just cut off the excess yarn and the bottom part of your project is done. Now it's time to create the flap, and for that we need to cast on 7 pegs. Just like before, we're going to secure the working yarn to the anchor peg, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to zigzag the working yarn through those 7 pegs, turn around, lay the working yarn flat over those pegs, and with your hook knit off those 3 pegs that have 2 loops, and then take your yarn behind peg 1, bring it forward, lay it over peg 2 and knit off, and go ahead and finish that row. Once you've done that, you finish the cast on for your flap, and then you're ready to begin row 2, which is very different from your last project. So in rows 2 through 8, you're going to follow this pattern: knit 1, purl 1, knit 3, purl 1, knit 1. And so we'll start with that knit 1 first, and I want you to see a basic pattern here, and that's that your edges are both knit. So you're going to start and end with a knit, and next to your edges are going to be a purl stitch, and this is so that the flap stays flat so that it doesn't curl. That's what those purl stitches do. So here in the middle, what you're going to do is you're going to knit these 3 pegs, and all 3 will be knit using the U-wrap version of the knit stitch. And just like I said before, here is the purl stitch, which is right next to the edge. So we're going to purl, and then we're going to knit the last peg right here. So I try to make it so that you can visualize this and you don't have to actually look at the written instruction for your flap, which is different, right? Your edges are knit, the pegs next to those edges are purl, and the ones in between are going to be knit stitches. So you need to do enough rows so that your total will be 8. Alright, just keep going with the pattern. You're going to knit 1, purl 1, you're then going to knit 3, and then remember that after those 3 knits, you're going to do a purl stitch, and your end, which is the last peg, just like the first one, will be a knit stitch. Time to do the basic bind off again. I started the bind off by bringing the edges in, so I brought the loop off peg 7 over by 1, and I did the same one over here only because I was gonna do a drawstring bind off, but I changed my mind. So you don't need to do this. You don't need to bring in the edges. See how I'm down to 5? You don't need to do this. You could just do the basic bind off with all 7 pegs, working on 2 pegs at a time, just like we did before. So I had already recorded this and I didn't want to change anything. I wanted to go ahead and finish the project. So you're just doing the basic bind off with all of your pegs instead of first working on those edges. So kind of ignore that first part right there. You already know how to do the basic bind off. You know that you work it over 2 pegs, and so just like before, you are knitting off peg 1, then take the loop over to 2, and you're going to then knit off, and there you have it. This is your last one. You knit off one more time and get your scissors. Make sure you leave a long enough tail because you're going to work with this string, and then pull on it and tighten to make a knot. Now you're going to stretch out your stitches like before, and you need to tighten that cast on, and you're going to tighten it just enough to kind of give it a curve on the end. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to close it so tight that it turns into a tube. So just enough to tighten your edges and curve the flap so that it looks rounded on the end. Then you need to take a needle and you're going to thread it with that working yarn where you did the cast on. And now you need to pay close attention because we're going to secure those stitches by going through the needle, not on the cast on stitches but the one right above, and we're on the back part of the flap. And as you see, I'm taking the stitches that are above the cast on stitches, not the actual cast on. And that's going to secure this, it's going to secure those stitches, and it's going to secure your yarn, and then you're going to weave in the excess one. Now you see they're nice and neat, and they're not going anywhere because you want to make sure that string is not going to fall, come out. And you're going to lose your cast on. So just make sure. And now once you've done the back part and everything is secure, then you can go ahead and feed your working yarn through those cast on loops. And that's going to make it look better, and it's just going to look neater. Then just weave in your ends, and like I said, normally I turn the fabric around and then I weave upward. And you can make a knot if you want to make sure nothing is going to come apart. Get your scissors, and you're going to cut off the excess yarn. And then the other end of the flap is what you're going to sew on to your bag. It has a little kind of loose stitch here, so I'm going to tighten it up just so it can look neater. I want to make sure that there aren't any stitches that are bigger than any of the other ones, and so I clean stuff up by sewing and making sure there's no openings or any loose stitches or any wide stitches. Right, then I get the back portion, and right here where there's like a little knob from where you sewed before, that's where you're going to sew the flap. And make sure that it's in the right direction so that once you attach it, when you turn the flap over, it will be in the right direction. And go ahead and attach the flap to the bag. And try to make sure your edges are nice and clean. And so what you're doing is that you're going from the stitches in the bag to the stitches on the flap. And you want to do this as neatly as possible. So you ever find yourself where you need to weave in the ends and you don't have enough space with your needle, then what you do is that you push the needle in first and then you thread it with that itty bitty bit of yarn or that you have left, and then you can feed it through easily. It's of course a lot easier when you cut enough of a tail so that you don't have this situation, but you know, stuff happens. So then again, just weave in upward once you go down and then cut off the excess yarn. It's better to put it as deep down as possible, but I didn't this time, and no big deal. So there you have it. Your flap is done, and now you want to line it up. And don't worry that the sides look like they're off. You'll see why it needed to be more narrow, and it will work itself out. Just make sure that you have a 20 millimeter clamp, and it will work out just fine. Again, the flap is just going to go over where your bag is flat. You're going to need that key, the chain ring, a chain extender, a charm, a jump ring, and like I said before, your 20 millimeter clamp, sometimes called a bookmark clamp, and pliers are good, and you will need your hook to do this part of the project. Alright, so let's begin to work with our hardware. And the first thing you need to do is take that clamp, and you're putting it on the top of the flap where you fold, and with your hook you're going to take those stitches, you're going to take the fabric and you're going to push it inward from like every end, from the sides, from the back, inside the flap. You want to make sure that that top and anything that looks a little funky and ugly, that all of it ends up inside of this clamp. So you're going to do one little side at a time. I'm doing this edge here, so I'm going to close that in first, then go to the other side, make sure again that I push the fabric in, and then after I feel well about it, then I go ahead and I flatten. I'm using flat nose pliers. It just works much neater. Try to make sure that you have this really nice and tight. And then you're going to open up the jump ring. This one comes open already, and that's what I'm going to use to attach my key ring. This one's a little heavier than most, and so it was a bit problematic to get on. They don't need to be this heavy, but that's what I had on hand, so that's what I'm using. Once your key ring is in, you close your jump ring, and then you can add the chain extender, and this is what I used to add my charms, and I can add that to that little hook that's on the tip of the clamp, or I can add it to the jump ring. You have the option to do either one. In this case, actually, I put it on the jump ring, so I closed the end where I attached it to the jump ring, and then on the other end I'm going to add my charm. So I open it like such. I get my charm, I'm going to add it, and this chain extender will flip your charm, so you can't put it in the wrong way if it only faces in one direction. If you just use like jump rings and stuff, you have to make sure that you put the charm in the right direction. Then you need, of course, to add a button, and in order to add your button, you need to make sure that the needle is going to fit through the little holes in the button for you to be able to attach it to the bag. And I want matching thread, and to do this I'm just going to unravel my yarn, and I'm going to take one of the 4-plies. This yarn happens to be a 4-ply yarn. I'm going to take one of them and I'm going to use it to attach my tiny button. You can use 2 of them if you want. One of them is not very strong, but I'm using this bag for like just something very small, so I'm not too worried about making it sturdy. And I'm not going to be opening it and closing it all the time, but if that's your plan, 1 ply is not a good idea. You probably should use 2. Then make sure to put a knot on one end. Before you start sewing, I'm going to put 2, and then I'm going to attach in the middle. Make sure that you put it right in the middle and go ahead and sew it. And I know you might be wondering why we didn't make a buttonhole on the flap in order to use the button, but with the way the stitch is, it's wide enough where I don't need to do a buttonhole, which would have created a whole other set of instructions. The yarn, the fabric on the yarn is going to open up enough to fit this very tiny button. So try to get a real small button that will fit nicely over the fabric. See, you'll see that I'm able to feed this button right through the stitches in the fabric, and that makes things way easier. The written pattern will include the purple and the light blue mini case. Alright guys, that's it. Thanks for watching the video. Remember to share it. It does help me a lot. Don't forget to like, comment, and if you haven't already done so, of course, subscribe.